I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Julie Fotheringham, psychoanalyst, dancer, and performance artist in New York City.
So what I was guessing that would be interesting, at least to begin with, is my own combination of dance and psychoanalysis. And I think initially I wrongly divided them as being two different things, that dance and the body and movement is one thing, and then psychoanalysis is something else, which is my initial idea of what psychoanalysis is. I viewed it as being something more intellectual, not so much the body, which was kind of a ridiculous idea because I've realized now that the body is so much a part of psychoanalysis. But I initially made this divide feeling like the first half of my life was dance. And then now it was in my 30s that I discovered psychoanalysis. And I had the idea that I was going to move towards something entirely different. Like now I'm going to be intellectual and do this thing that's completely different from dance. And the way that I initially heard about psychoanalysis, because it wasn't a part of my life. I didn't know what it was, actually. It was an ex-boyfriend, someone who I was dating 10 years ago, who is an academic, and he, a very accomplished academic, tenured professor, and he was interested in psychoanalysis and also interested in the possibility of doing psychoanalytic training and becoming an analyst himself. So I got curious about psychoanalysis, like what is this thing that he is so interested in? Someone who is already accomplished in their field, like why would you need something else? Like why would that be interesting? So I think that sparked my initial curiosity, is this like mysterious thing that I knew nothing about, but it was interesting to him, so it must be interesting. So that was my initial. I feel like a lot of the things that I've gotten really interested in my life have started as this sort of enigmatic thing that I know nothing about, but there's like some hint of there must be something there. So that was my initial introduction. So then I started looking into it myself, and with Freud, and then later on I got interested in Lacan.
But I think it's a really good point, because a lot of people think of it as this really intellectual exercise, and it's seen also as this kind of like narcissistic, indulgent thing that people do. They go and lay there 4 times a week, 5 times a week, and just talk about themselves. But it is really visceral, and it does have everything to do with the body, and I think that's something that's been left out a lot or isn't really understood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think maybe because he was an academic and a like philosophy professor, so I think I had the idea, I just lumped it in with being something really intellectual. And then also my entry into Lacan was initially via Bruce Fink, who focuses a lot on the early Lacan. So it's very much the symbolic, it's about the signifier, it's about speech, it's about language. So I think that reinforced my idea that it's that the body isn't really that primary. But then now with the group that I study with, where we read the work of Miller and his interpretations of Lacan, which really brings it back around to the body, that it's looking more at the late Lacan. And I think he even takes it a step further to where the unconscious it's not so much the old Lacan still applies, but it's not so much focused on the unconscious structured like a language, but the unconscious as real, and the speaking body being the unconscious. So I think I kind of went, when I thought I was moving away from dance and away from the body, like it circled itself back around to touch the body again. So I think it's been an interesting pathway.
That's great, because I haven't really read a lot of Miller, and I was just thinking, since the last guest that I had on, Isabel Millar, she was talking about Millerian ideas as well, and I realized that I really want to start reading Miller as well. And now that you say that, that's really sounds like more in line with my way of thinking about things too.
Great, yeah, I listened to that episode and I enjoyed it, and I think I've sensed a little bit in New York City anyway that there's a divide between like the Millerians and the not so Millerians, and I'm not so interested in the politics of that, but I think it was just an act of contingency that I ended up in the group that was more Millerian. Just like somebody who I knew introduced me to the group. I started going to the group, and then like it ended up being Millerian. But then it ended up being perfect for me anyway, because it is in contact with the body.
Well, what's it been like, kind of transitioning from a life of being a professional dancer to being a psychoanalyst?
It's been a challenge. Most dancers that I know who move into some sort of therapeutic practice, they usually go towards something more body-oriented, either involving movement or touch. It probably would have made more sense for me to move into something like that, or to move into dance movement therapy. But those things weren't interesting to me. I think that the fact that psychoanalysis was so foreign to me, that's what made it interesting. It was like something entirely different. Like I had been a body person my whole life. Like I know movement, I know my body. Like I don't have anything. I mean, there's always more to learn, but it's like I feel like I kind of did that. And then the world of psychoanalysis was such like a challenge to me. It was like I was walking into this, I don't know, it's like such an alien space I'm not even really much of a speaker. Like I'm a pretty quiet person. So I felt like I was moving into this world of speech from more the world of the body, where I feel comfortable dancing and expressing myself bodily, into this place where I feel entirely uncomfortable. So it was kind of a crazy decision to move in that direction, but I think that there was something pulling me towards it. And I think that I continue to be in formation as a always becoming psychoanalyst. I don't think I'll ever master it, which is good, because then what do you do once you figured it all out? Where are you going to go from there? So yeah, I continue to try to figure it out.
And it sounds like a necessary kind of polarity to start like integrating.
Yeah. And I don't think that the polarity or the separation that I initially created, which I think is like a false divide, like body and mind, like there's something different. But that's how I had understood it. I don't think that it was working very well for me initially, because it was like all of a sudden I was in this foreign territory, and it's like, what do I do with my body? Like, oh, I'm not allowed to dance. you know, like as an analyst, I sit and listen, or as a patient, I lay on the couch and speak. And it's like, where is my body, and where is the body in psychoanalysis? But then the more that I've practiced, I see like the body is all over the place, like in the speech and people talking about their bodies, and without using the body directly, like there's no movement or contact, but the body is very present in the room.
Yeah, and I noticed as well, I took voice lessons a few years ago, and the body was so present, and my memories were so present when I was using my voice. And I hadn't realized before how physical your voice is, but of course it is. But I hadn't really thought about it in that way until I started having to use it in different ways and trying to sing or speak differently. And it was like stretching in ways that it hadn't in a long time, or moving in ways that it hadn't ever, and like all these childhood memories were coming up, and like bodily sensations. It was so fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's really helpful to keep in mind that speech is bodily, and the voice comes from the body. It's not something like that's off detached somewhere else. That it is. I mean, there's speech is the speech of or language of the other, but still, like the voice itself, like the reverberations of the voice, it is bodily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's something that's just starting to like come back into like the practice of psychoanalysis. It's like the mind and body and voice are not separate, that it's we're one organism. And it sounds like so banal, but it's true, and it's really lost. There's not this like mind body divide. Maybe that's why like when people used to think of having a soul, maybe that was kind of a problem with that, is they thought of it as something other that was like entrapped in the body, but it's not. We're not an other thing entrapped in the body.
Yes, I agree with what you said about the soul being something like separate from the body, and that's not necessarily the case.
What about dreams?
What about dreams?
What's your dream life like?
Like my actual dreams? My unconscious is very active and gives me information. Occasionally I'll dream about a patient, and I think it gives me some clue as to what to do or not do with them, which is really interesting.
My dream life is very active as well.
Yeah, I think especially I'm in my own psychoanalysis as well, and I make a conscious effort to remember them. And I think that before I was in my analysis, I would dream and kind of remember it, and I never really made much of it. But now, recognizing the importance of dreams, and I'll write it down in my journal. Some of them I'll tell to my analyst, some I just never make it into the room, but they still are alive in some way.
It still has an effect. Like you said, even if you dream of a patient or something, you don't have to bring it into the room. It still has an effect,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or like if you talk about someone in supervision, whenever I talk about a certain patient in supervision, there's always like a shift in the treatment, even though clearly the patient doesn't know that I was talking about them in supervision, Exactly. And I found that it's like almost, it feels kind of supernatural in a way, that all of a sudden, whatever sort of like if feeling stuck on a case, and then I go into the next session with the patient, and all of a sudden like something's shifted. Mm-hmm. It's like, how did you even know we were talking about you? It's the unconscious.
Yeah. Well, I thought it might be interesting to tell a little bit of my story of being a dancer. So I was a gymnast when I was younger, and when I think the big story of my performing career when I was a professional dancer and acrobat is the story around Cirque du Soleil. And I think it's similar to my introduction to psychoanalysis. It was another thing that started out as this enigma that had some sort of appeal, like there must be something there. And the way that I first heard about Cirque du Soleil was by my sister, who was living in Las Vegas. And this is in the early 90s. And it was the new thing that everybody was talking about in Vegas. And it was like this really bizarre avant-garde performance is how she described it. And I was like, what is this thing? It must be really interesting. And she had made me a copy of the soundtrack of Mystère on cassette tape. And I remember listening to the soundtrack like over and over again. And it has like, kind of like new agey music, and all of the lyrics are like a made up language. So it seemed like really mysterious and bizarre. And I was like, what is this thing? It sounds really like fascinating. So then it was when I we ended up moving to Vegas. And then when I was a gymnast in Jim Katz's Gymnastics in Las Vegas, my gymnastics coach there just happened to be a performer in Mystère. So he got me in to see the show from the light booth. And when I saw it, I felt like it was the most amazing thing that I've ever seen. That as a gymnast with a sort of a naive aesthetic standard, like I think that it was the first thing that I had seen that like theater thing that resembled art, and I was so excited about it. Elements of it that were just kind of bizarre or mysterious. It just like pulled me into the performance, and it was I decided that that's what I want to do. I want to be a performer in Cirque du Soleil. But at the time, it wasn't even that much of a goal. Like I thought it was more, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could be in Cirque du Soleil, but not feeling like that would ever actually be a possibility, like not even really knowing like how to go about doing that. So it wasn't until a couple of years later that I actually auditioned, and in that audition I was cut like right away. Like they had us do some tumbling on the floor and then got rid of a bunch of people. And I think that I had like the delusional idea that I was going to get in on the first audition. So I was just like devastated. I'm like, oh no, my dreams are crushed. But then it was 2 years later that I auditioned again. And in that audition, I actually made it all the way through to the end, which made me a potential candidate to be in one of their shows. And at that point, I thought something would come of it, but nothing did. So then it was, I believe 2 years later, I auditioned again. And in that audition, I was cut. So it was like, now am I not a candidate anymore? So then at that point, I decided to put in one last effort to get in. And I put together a demo video and sent it to Montreal. And it's like, this is, my last shot. And then at that point, I had been hired by Disney to perform in Tokyo in their theme park. So I'm like, I send off the video, one last shot, and like, now I'm just going to forget about it. This is something that's not going to happen. I tried my best. It's just not going to happen. So then it wasn't until I was in Tokyo for a while, and I would, this was like in the early 2000s. So at the time, like I didn't even have a computer. So I would go to the internet cafe occasionally and check my email. And one day I went in and I was checking my Hotmail account, and just like by chance, I was like, I wonder what went to my spam. Like I never look at the spam. So I went to my spam account, and there was an email from the casting director of Cirque du Soleil inviting me to come and be in a workshop for one of their new shows that they're creating for Las Vegas. So that was how it finally happened.
I didn't know you lived in Tokyo.
Yeah, I was in my early 20s at the time. I lived in Tokyo for a year and a half performing in a show for Disney.
What was that like?
Tokyo was difficult, I think, because I was so young and kind of ignorant at the time, and having this sort of idea of like American-ness, that it was, the culture was so different from what I was used to that I really didn't like it at all. I think now I would have a more sophisticated way of approaching Japanese culture, but at the time I was just like, I don't understand why everybody conforms and everybody follows the rules. Like it didn't make any sense to me, and like really follows the rules. Like I actually got in trouble for crossing the street on a no walk sign. So it's like very kind of rigid and and like everybody's so compliant and obedient, and I just really didn't like that. I was like, I made me too much of a rebel for it.
So you lived in Vegas, and what was that like? What was it like being in Cirque du Soleil? I lived in Vegas for 12 years. I actually moved there midway through high school. Vegas is kind of like an odd place to live. Like, it's very boring. I mean, where the houses are, it's like the suburbs, you know, you have your Walmart, and then the center is all the tourism. I actually, prior to being in Cirque du Soleil, I worked in 2 other Las Vegas productions that, actually, in retrospect, I think I had more fun. I was in this show that used to be at the Luxor, and it was called Imagine, and it was kind of trying to be Cirque du Soleil, but not quite up to the standard. But I feel like I had more fun in that show than when I finally got into Cirque du Soleil. That was like the thing that I wanted. But it's always that way.
I know.
Maybe not always, but I think always.
Yeah. It's always such a disappointment once you get this thing that you thought was going to be something, and I was like, oh, okay.
It's the thing. It's never the thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's why once I got into Cirque, and it was such a process getting in, I only stayed for 1 contract. And my contract was for the creation of the show, and then for 2 years of performing the show. So it ended up being like 3, almost 4 years altogether. But once my initial contract was finished, at that point, I decided that I wanted to move to New York to be more of an artist. So I had to shift my want to something else.
That's what I was going to ask, how you ended up in New York.
Well, what's funny is when I gave up on getting into Cirque and went to Tokyo, my thought was, okay, Cirque isn't going to happen, so I have to figure out something else to want. And so at that point, it was like, okay, after Tokyo, I'm either going to move to New York City or I'm going to go somewhere in Europe. I had 2 different things that I wanted to do: to be in a modern contemporary dance company that where I really was invested in the work, and then also I wanted to create my own performances. But then I ended up getting into Cirque, so I had to reshift my thinking to go back to Vegas. And then at the end of that contract, I decided that I would move to New York City. And with the aim, initially I had the idea that I was going to do a solo show that never ended up happening. I applied to a few different venues and I didn't find a venue for it. And then I met my collaborator that I worked with for years, and we worked as a duet. And he's not a dancer; he's a video artist and musician. So we did a lot of stuff with technology and like live cameras and projection, and then incorporating movement. And we worked together for about 5 years, and then now he's living in Zurich, so that was the end of our collaboration.
So what's his name?
My collaborator? Mm-hmm. Jared Lauder.
And he's in Zurich now?
Yeah, not in Zurich, but like in the mountains somewhere around Zurich. Yeah, he was, but when he was in New York City, he was a professor at the School of Visual Arts. And I was fortunate that he had those resources. We used the space there to rehearse, and also used a lot of their equipment for our performances, which is we wouldn't have had access to all of that if it wasn't for his connections. I think that worked out well.
So are you doing any dance pieces currently or recently, or?
I occasionally perform. I think my main venue right now is I video myself dancing and then post it online. But there's also another, I think because I don't have a lot of time to invest in doing a full-scale production, I do more low-key improvisation work. And there's a series that I participate in every once in a while that's put on by Movement Research. It's very casual, low-key in a dance studio that I'll perform in that every once in a while. And we're also doing something, actually, the candidate journal is going to be, we're having an event in April where there will be performances. So I'll do some sort of improvisation as a part of that.
How did that come about?
So we're finally releasing our latest issue, and in celebration of that, and also to raise money to cover the expenses of the journal, decided to put on a performance event, and just thinking that would be more interesting than other things.
The usual.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to talk a little bit about what the Candidate Journal is. And
so the Candidate Journal, we inherited it from a previous board of editors, and it was what it is the idea is that candidates from all different institutes in New York City tend to not communicate with each other, and then also so it's like we're not affiliated with any particular institute, but creating a space where candidates of various institutes can be published. And I think actually one thing that's really good about the issue that we're coming out with right now is that I think almost all of the articles that we're publishing are written by candidates, whereas the previous issue, which is an excellent issue, but a lot of it was more established practitioners. So I think that we're really giving a space for candidates to be able to publish.
That's wonderful. And who's working on it with you now?
The issue editors for this issue, which is on screens, is myself, Emma Lieber, Anna Fischone, and Monroe Street are the other people participating.
And how did the idea for screens come about?
I think that was Emma's idea initially.
Do you ever think about writing about the body and dance and psychoanalysis?
I think so. I think I'm still figuring it out. I'm part of a cartel now. I just started being part of a cartel that is, the theme of the cartel is the body. And my own particular question is the place of the body in the practice of psychoanalysis, because I feel like that's where I'm the most lost, like, with being analyst, sitting in the chair, being patient, laying on the couch, where is the body in this situation? Which is an ongoing question for myself. And I mean, part of the idea of a cartel is that you will produce something at the end. You'll produce a work of writing. So we'll see what comes out of that. I hope to have. I think it's an ongoing question for me and an ongoing project to try to. I don't know why it's so precarious that the two keep separating themselves, but to keep to figure out like the place of the body in the practice of psychoanalysis.
Well, it's a good point too, because the positions in psychoanalysis are so particular. Like, there's no other time where you're laying on a couch and somebody's sitting behind you listening to you in that way. It's like such a particular position for the bodies to be in, but that's not written about a whole lot or talked about.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. And there was, I have kind of a funny story in my previous analysis. I was laying on the couch. He's sitting behind me, and there was a food delivery person who like had the wrong door and like didn't knock or anything, but just like opened the door. And I was like laying on the couch, and like he's sitting there, and like, just what does that look like? On surprise, like what would people think were going on? It is like, if you do actually take a step back and look at it, it's really bizarre, that arrangement.
It's weird, yeah. And it's meant, it puts you in a really vulnerable position, and that's part of it, and that's part of why it helps you to speak. But there's definitely, it's definitely unusual, and it definitely takes getting used to. I feel like I've been involved with psychoanalysis in some way for so long now that I can't really remember what it was like before or right in the beginning. But I'm sure it was quite an adjustment to get into the kind of rhythm of this sort of situation and setup.
Yeah. It can be really difficult I've had patients that move to the couch and then go back to sitting up. It can be really, it's hard. I find it's hard to speak when you're in that situation.
Yeah, I'm flexible with that too. I've had patients move back and forth before as well. So they don't have to feel like just because you try the couch now you're like stuck to the couch forever, you know? Like if you need to, you can sit up, or I've had people go both directions. And the same thing with the frequency of the treatment. You know, when you're in a International Psychoanalytic Association kind of standard training or treatment, you have to be 4 times a week and this sort of thing. But I have patients come 4 times, 5 times, 2 times, 3 times, 1 time every other week, you know, depending on what's going on in life and how their circumstances change over the years. I've had them go from sitting to laying down and vice versa, and it's worked out depending on, you know, whatever their needs are at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And I think the IPA standards, it's supposed to be 4 times a week, which is so arbitrary, which actually I think might lead into speaking about psychoanalytic training and the requirements. Yeah, I think I'll tell my story of the always ongoing becoming psychoanalyst. And so once I decided that I was going to go on this pathway of becoming a psychoanalyst, so then I thought that the way to become a psychoanalyst is to do psychoanalytic training, because that's what makes you a psychoanalyst. But at the time, all I had was a bachelor's degree in dance. And in order to do psychoanalytic training, you have to have a master's degree in something. So somebody advised me to get a master's in social work, and that way I could use the social work license to practice psychoanalysis. So I got my master's in social work from Hunter College, and then went into psychoanalytic training. And I think I had the idea that the experience of psychoanalytic training would be something different. I had this expectation or wish that it would be something rigorous and also stimulating. And the program that I went into is a really intensive, long program. Like it takes people 10 years to get through it. So the idea of going into something deeply and coming out 10 years later being a psychoanalyst. But then my actual experience of psychoanalytic training was not what I was expecting. And I found that I was doing the formal training, but then also on the side, I found these other things like das Unbehagen, and then also the Lacan group that I go to, which is the Lacanian Compass group that's connected to the new Lacanian school. So those 2 things I was going to as like a supplement, like on the side of my psychoanalytic training. But then in my experience, these little, like the side supplements were more exciting for me. And and then it got to a point where it's like, why am I doing this training if I'm not excited by it, if it's not stimulating for me? Why am I paying money for these courses? And then also part of the requirement of psychoanalytic training is your own training analysis, which the requirement is 450 hours, 3 days a week for my institute that I was going to, which is entirely arbitrary. Like, who says 450 hours and then you're done? And then so I came to a point, and this is after completing 3 years of training, where like everything just kind of came to a head at once. And I was feeling frustrated in my training analysis. I felt like it was dead and it wasn't going anywhere. And I felt frustrated with the courses that I was taking. And then also, once I had decided that I was going to practice in a Lacanian way, it didn't really make sense to me to keep taking these other courses that are ways of working that that I'm not interested in doing. Like, I already had an overview of everything. I had an idea of different ways of thinking. So if to focus on being practicing it in the Lacanian orientation, it would make sense to focus more on that. So it was a little bit over a year ago. Like, these three things kind of coincided. And the other thing, there was the two things that were sort of the last straw. I was going to a class at my institute that was like at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday. There was only 3 people in the class, and like the instructor was like falling asleep during the, like it was felt so dead. And I just like, I left the class and I'm like, why am I doing this? And then I got home, and in my mailbox there was a invitation for the graduation ceremony of the institute, and it was at this like super bourgeois art mansion in Gramercy, and like the ticket was really expensive, and I just feeling like, do I even want to be a part of this? Like, why am I doing this? So that was like, that day was it. And I made my own cut there, and I quit my training analysis, just shy of fulfilling the 450 hours. I think I was at like 436. I quit the analysis. I quit going to the class. I was like halfway through a 12-week course. I quit going to the class, and just like it was a very abrupt, like, no, why am I doing this? And then I decided at that point that I would only do things that I'm interested in doing, and that stimulate me and make me excited about psychoanalysis. And so I've moved away from the Institute towards doing my own formation, which involves the Lacanian Compass group. And then I switched analysts, so now I'm going to a Lacanian analyst. I have a Lacanian supervisor, the cartel, going to Unbehagen events, and then also a peer supervision group with Unbehagen. So like piecing together my own formation out of things that I actually want to do, and that help me practice and make me excited about psychoanalysis. So that's the pathway that I've decided to take.
That's wonderful. That experience sounds very similar to what happened to me too.
And I think once I discovered Lacan, like and not to say that everything else is bad or boring, but like there's nothing like Lacan, just to be honest. Like it's very special, and I think it's I personally feel like if it wasn't for Lacan, I don't know if I would still be interested in psychoanalysis. I think that I can't even really articulate what it is, but to me it feels so different from most other perspectives.
Yeah, and especially the school I was in, at least, was teaching mostly ego psychologists. And then once I started reading Lacan and then found out he was analyzed by an ego psychologist, I was like, I completely understand why he ran out of his analysis. Because I get it. I'm going to run out of mine too. And I went and got a Lacanian. I asked David Lichtenstein to supervise me, and then I got a Lacanian analyst too. And I think Lacan also, like his return to Freud, really that's what you need to read, Freud and Lacan. And Lacan reread Freud because he was right. Everything got so completely on a completely different trajectory. And everyone, paid homage that Freud started this whole thing, but the theory and the practice had gotten so far removed from, I feel like, what Freud's original intention was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And actually, to give the institute that I went to a little bit of credit, in the initial courses, it was a lot of reading Freud, which I might not have read that much Freud if it were based on my own motivation. So,
I think that's a good point, though, because my institute, I had already been reading a lot of Freud on my own, but I think in the beginning the training was better because we were reading Freud, and then when I started getting more into the ego psychologist and other things, it kind of lost me. And I think in that, that's why I feel like training or psychoanalytic formation should be more like an individual basis, because it was useful in the beginning, but at some point, just like any other relationship, it like ran its course, it served its time, it wasn't useful anymore. And once something's not useful for you anymore or serving you well, you shouldn't be stuck in it just to like accumulate, like you said, a certain amount of hours, because psychoanalysis doesn't work like that. Like you analyze yourself, you get analyzed a certain amount of time, it runs its course. You can't say how long that's going to be. I understand like them saying like you need to analyze patients for a minimum of 18 months. Fine, that seems like reasonable. But as long as like the idea of like how many times per week, and that 3 times or 4 times or 2 times, like the patient's committed to treatment, a lot of the process is happening outside the room as well. And if their life circumstances are changing because they're in analysis, like why should they be inhibited or restrained? Same with you. You're like, if I'm getting a better job and getting teaching positions and stuff because I'm doing my own growth and like work on myself, like why should you be stuck in this kind of prefabricated structure that's not really based on anything?
Yeah, and it's also the use of quantification to say that something is, you do your 450 hours, you do your 3 or 4 times a week, that I think it gives like a sense of solidity to it, like that it's something that's done, the requirement is met, you can, check it. Whereas the subjective experience of going through an analysis is more ambiguous, and like how can you really say if it's done or not?
And especially like you said, like you got a master's in social work first. So that's the other thing. When I went into training, I had a PsyD, a doctorate in psychology, so I already have a license under that, and I didn't really understand that I could do psychoanalysis with the license that I already had. I thought I had to get this certification from a psychoanalytic institute, but you don't. You just have to feel like you've studied it enough, you've undergone your own analysis. That's your decision as a professional when you feel like you're ethically able to practice psychoanalysis. So it's not like a license that you need.
Yeah. And I don't think I realized it at the time, because I had thought that I would complete a psychoanalytic training, that getting the master's in social work and having the social work license has given me liberty to leave the institute when I came to the point where it wasn't useful for me anymore. Whereas if I needed the license in psychoanalysis, I would have to continue. So as far as calling yourself a psychoanalyst and the self-authorization is something that I don't think you can just call yourself a psychoanalyst. That you have to have a process and be in check with other people. But the institute is not the only way to do it. There are other ways that are maybe even better. So my introduction to Lacan, prior to Fink, when I was in my social work program, there was as an elective, there was a psychoanalytic technique, and we read the Mirror Stage, which was the first Lacan that I had ever read, and I remember initially hating it. It was like it's only 3 pages long, but it's like it goes all over the place. It goes like 12 different places, and it didn't make any sense. And I was like, who is this arrogant French person who, is so esoteric and like alienating everyone by being so hard to understand? And then it was later that I discovered Fink, which I think kind of like softened the entry into Lacan, made it a little more palatable to begin with. And one thing that really resonated with me, so I had completed my social work program, which I appreciate Hunter because of the social justice aspect of it. It's very much like there was a lot about race and poverty, and I think that that's very important. On the clinical side, it was very relational and also about empathy empathy and, feeling what the patient is feeling. And it got to a point where it felt like a little too warm and fuzzy for my style. And I also don't think that that's very helpful for the patient to be like, oh, I feel what you feel. So then reading Fink, like one of the first things, and I think it was the clinical introduction to Lacanian psychoanalysis, that like the first thing they said is like, it's not about empathy. And not that empathy is bad, but the way that most people go about empathy is by relating it to your own experience. And once you're in your own experience, you're not listening to their experience and not recognizing the difference that you might have had a similar life experience, but their experience, the patient's experience of it, is something entirely different. So I think I was like, oh, thank God, it's not about like empathic attunement anymore. Like I can relax and like listen to what the patient is saying. So I think that really resonated with me. And then that kind of like eased me into reading Lacan more. And then I took it as a challenge. I'm like, this is so hard to read. I'm really going to read this. So that I started reading the seminars and some of the écrits. And it's an ongoing process. I haven't read everything. But I also think that there's something about the difficulty of it that is exciting for me. That reading a Lacan seminar from start to finish, I feel like his way of kind of tucking around things and then entering from different ways and then like re-entering and then tucking around. And I feel like when I read a Lacan seminar from start to finish that I've been on this journey, like he took me somewhere. And I can't really tell you exactly where we went, but we went somewhere and I came out at the end being different.
Yeah, and that way I always feel like it's like mirrors the psychoanalytic process, and that's what I really like about his work, because the seminars are all spoken and not written, but I feel like you kind of like I tell people, like, you don't have to understand everything he's saying or know all the references or whatever, just like get whatever you get out of it and keep reading it and see, you'll pick up things, and if you read it again you'll pick up different things, and it's fine, Not everyone has to be like a Lacanian scholar philosopher to get stuff out of it and understand it. And I don't think it's meant to be taken that way. The écrit is very different. When you read that, it's like every sentence you could talk about for an hour. Like a David Lichtenstein study group, we could read like one paragraph for an hour and a half, and just talk about all the references. But the speaking is very different. Yeah. Like even aside from like understanding the content of Lacan seminars, I feel like it does something to you. To reading, there was like what he starts to say and then what he says next. It was always like, I felt like in reading most things, with the beginning of a sentence, you have an idea of what the end of the sentence is going to be. But with Lacan, it would be like, what the fuck just happened? Like it was these like kind of like turns that I think that I've adapted enough to his style to have a sense of how it goes. But initially, like it felt really jarring. But I think that carries over into the process of practicing, because just like always expecting a surprise, and not like because the patient is saying such and such, you think that the next thing they're going to say is such and such. But to be open for that moment that something different happens. Yeah, it's a great way of putting it. Mm-hmm. What Millet would you recommend to start with? He has, I think it's from his seminar, his ordinary psychosis, which introduces the diagnosis as like kind of replacing what like people call borderline, but when there's not a clear a differential diagnosis between neurotic and psychotic, and ordinary psychosis is on the side, structurally on the side of psychosis, but I think that it adapts to the
the people that we see today in the clinic, that it's not the same. We're not in the same world of Freud or of Lacan even, and it can't be taken for granted anymore that the patient is going to be neurotic, that there has to be clear signs of neurosis in order to call the patient a neurotic. So kind of leaning on the side of being careful and understanding potential psychosis until you know for sure that there are definite signs of the name of the father, of being like repression and being connected to the symbolic order.
And maybe I wonder if that maybe sometimes, I mean, I haven't read it, so I don't know what he says, but I wonder if maybe more people might fit into that kind of gray area because of the kind of chronic nature of stress and that sort of thing. Like there's so many people, what they call like these like chronic cases of post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that, where people are just constantly exposed to trauma and constantly re-traumatized or abused or something.
Yeah, I think so, and it also seems that there needed to be when you have a patient who's not overtly psychotic, that there a space for like an in-between space almost, that they're not quite fully connected to the symbolic, like it's very precarious.
It's like loose.
Like slipping away from the symbolic, but they're not Schreiber, like they're not like full-on psychosis.
Like in a psychotic episode, but it could happen.
Yeah.
Or it could not happen. Mm-hmm. It's like being on the edge.
Yeah, I think that's also the reason to be careful with these patients when you don't quite know yet, to not... Once you're clear that you have a neurotic, then you can be enigmatic and cut sessions and try to shake things up. But when you don't quite know yet, like I lean on the side of caution to begin with, to not do something that's going to throw someone into a psychotic episode.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely found, like, when I was in training for my PsyD, I worked in a lot of hospitals with, like, severe mental illness, and, you know, there was always these times where they would say, like, my supervisors would say, like, don't go into people's dreams too much, like, you don't want them to go outside of waking reality more, because they're already outside of it enough. So like our idea was that we had to ground people a lot more, and like if they started talking about their dreams, I'd be like, how did you sleep last night, and kind of bring them back to like the materiality of sleep rather than like their dream life and that sort of thing. And even though I haven't heard anything about that in any sort of psychoanalytic training or formation, it's still something that I do sometimes even if people that are neurotic seem particularly stressed, or like they might be, you know, really having a crisis moment, I'll still use those techniques to kind of help them ground a bit more, because they don't need to be kind of thrown off anymore. Mm-hmm. But I think that's more with patients that I have that are experiencing more chronic forms of stressors and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as someone who wants to be a psychoanalyst, I think it's easy to get sucked into, they're talking about their dreams. How exciting, let's go there. And to be able to bring it back in and be a little bit more concrete. And yeah,
it's been useful sometimes. So that's why I try to remember all the techniques I've learned, because even in patients that have been in analysis once in a while, that kind of thing can be useful. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's never happened like in a patient that's in analysis proper, where they're coming 4 times a week or something like that. And then that in itself, just coming to the office that often, I feel, is like the container, or whatever you want to call it, that keeps them very grounded. But if someone's only coming once a week or something like that, sometimes they might need something a little more stabilizing.
Yeah.
What's the last seminar you read?
Of Lacan?
Yeah.
So in the group, the Lacanian Compass group that I go to, we are reading Seminar 5, the new translation that came out by Russell Gregg.
I have not read that one yet.
I'm only partway through it. I won't spoil the ending.
How is it so far?
We're really just beginning. It's early Lacan, the formations of the unconscious. So it is very much about the symbolic and about wit and slips of the tongue, and which is still entirely useful in practice.
Nice. Yeah, I just decided, 3 days ago that I just have to see which ones I actually have, and then finally just order all the rest of the ones that are translated into English so that I have them. Because I think I have 20 and 10, and I think I have 6 maybe. But I just need them all. I realized once I left the office in New York, I was reading a lot of Jameson's things. And all these things that I thought I had, I didn't actually have. They were Jameson's. Like the Foucault, too. I wanted to read reference Foucault today, The History of Madness. And I was like, where's my History of Madness? I'm like, it's in New York. It's Jameson's. It's not mine. So I have to take a psychoanalytic inventory and order some books to get my library beefed back up.
No, but it's a phantom limb. You feel like you still have it.
Exactly. I was so used to being in the office with Jameson. Wait, where's my office?
Should I say something about Das Unbehagen and my fantasy of Das Unbehagen?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So my introduction to Unbehagen was another instance of hearsay that gave the idea that there was something exciting that I didn't know about. And so I heard about Unbehagen from someone, and then I Googled it and went to the Unbehagen website. And it was the old website that there used to be where you needed a login in order to get in to the website. So there was the idea that it was something hard to get into, but there must be something really exciting there. So then the process to get a login, you needed to email someone. So I sent the email and then didn't hear anything back. And then I tried again. I sent another email and finally got a login to go into the website. So I'm finally in. And then to get in, once I was in, there wasn't really a lot there. I think there was only a couple of videos posted, and that was what was in there. But I think it was the idea of there being something mysterious and something exciting that was hard to get at, and that there was something there. And then once I finally got on to the listserv, and then there was an announcement for the general party meeting that was in the space in Soho in the basement, and then getting in there was another step of trying to get into something that's hard to get into. And then I remember showing up at the building and not knowing which buzzer to buzz, and scrolling through the names, and there was Kafka as one of the names. And I was like, oh, this is so Kafka-esque, this hard thing to get into, and everything is futile. So it's I'm buzzing Kafka, and finally got in. And then I also so then the meeting was in the basement space where the offices were. So it was literally something underground, this underground meeting that was really secret and exciting. And a lot of that is my own fantasy, but I think that it corresponds to my fantasy of, and this is my connection to Judson Church and the dance movement that happened in the 60s and 70s, where it was dancers who were fed up with conventional dance and even modern dance in New York City, and decided to come together in the basement of a church and do what became postmodern dance. And do like the happenings and improvisations using pedestrian movement and just doing something like entirely different from what would be like more the institution of dance. So in my own mind, I made this parallel between Unbehagen and Judson. So I had like this fantasy. It was like the Judson of psychoanalysis. And then like also coincidentally, like at the same time, there was an event where it was a reading of civilization and its discontents at Judson Church. So it was like this bizarre combination of these like two fantasies that I had in my mind coming together. It was like, what is going on? Like this is the Judson of psychoanalysis, and like this is where the exciting thing is happening. It's underground. It's not in the formal institutes. It's like something else that's outside of. And then, yeah, I've been. That was my entry into Unbehagen, and then I've continued to feel the same excitement with the events, and I think. It's not so much that it's the undergroundness, but the fact that everything that is done by Unbehagen is because of people want to. Like nobody's telling you have to do something. You create an event if you want to. You go to something if you want to. It's not like requirements, like you have to do such and such. That keeps it alive. That it's all out of the desire of what people want to do. And I've found it really helpful in my own approach to psychoanalysis and keeping it stimulating.
No, it's a great point. That's the whole purpose. And like you said, like it can be a complement to someone's training, or you can do your own formation independently if you so choose. It's really up to each individual. And maybe that is why it's still alive, because it is, it has lulls and it has events. I mean, I think when we first started, we were doing something like every single week, and then there's been periods where there aren't events for a little while, or there's people that were once doing events as Unbehagen or doing their own events somewhere else, under their own name or, with another group or whatever. But I like that it's eclectic in that way, but continues to. I love that there was a general meeting again recently. That made me so happy.
And there was the idea of having them regularly. I don't know if that's going to continue. But I think there are efforts to keep it going. I think there's something necessary about it dying down for it to come back up again. Like if it's this perpetual effort, if it becomes an effort like drudgery, like we have to keep this going, then it doesn't have the same flavor as like, okay, there's a space where nothing's happening. I want to make something happen, which it has a different feeling to it.
Exactly, and that's how it started in the first place. And if someone, like you said, like if somebody notices, like the trans psychoanalysis working group that's going on, somebody wanted to have an event, and then the working group that keeps the discussion ongoing has been born from the event. And, they're meeting in New York in person, but then they're sending emails around to anybody who's interested in the topic to like follow along with the readings and that sort of thing. If you don't live in New York and you can't be there in person, that's been really great to be able to keep in touch with it in that way, even being in Europe now. Yeah.
So you're so now I'm going to interview you. So you're started keeping Unbehagen going Euro style.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking. I haven't done anything yet, but just since I finally now settled, I have in the spring. In May in particular, I have like 4 different conferences that I'm speaking at. So there's the CIV conference, Psychoanalysis for Psychoanalysis and Philosophy. And they're having their conference in Stockholm in May 2nd to 4th. So I'm speaking there. And then there's another conference for psychoanalysis and politics that Lene Osted does, also in Stockholm from May 10th to 12th. So those are both happening. And then Carl and I are having our conference on esoteric modernism and psychoanalysis in Italy, May 30th to June 1st. And then I come back to Sweden, and then there's a conference that I'm speaking at on like inpatient art, like patients that make art in the psychiatric hospitals. So I'm speaking at that. It's like in Gothenburg, Sweden, from June 10th and 11th, or 11th and 12th. So it's very busy that period of time. So there are things happening. So I think between having those conferences, and then Manya and I did the book on violence and psychoanalysis, and then Rendering will be out in a few weeks. So we're going to have launch parties for both of those books in April. So I think I'll meet people then, and then at these conferences, and then I'll see, like, you know, who wants to study Lacan? This is this thing I did in New York, kind of see what we can get going, because, the idea that any psychoanalyst has to be an IPA is something I'm fundamentally against at this point. So there must be other people that either aren't in the IPA that are psychoanalysts, or are Lacanians, or both, or don't know that they don't have to be in the IPA to be a psychoanalyst. So if there are, I would like to meet them and work with them too.
Yeah, you'll have to find them.
Exactly. So I'm sure it will happen in time. So
there's you had asked about my dreams previously, and I have a couple of reoccurring dreams. And one is that I'm back in a Cirque du Soleil show, or it's a new Cirque du Soleil show, and these dreams are always blissful. That's one form of the dream. And then the other dream is that I'm back in a show with the music group that I toured with. And I still have this sort of nostalgia for touring with them. And we did, I think it was just fun because it was this perfect combination of, we would be in these big like music festivals with like thousands of people and like really high energy, but then also the choreography that was done by Vanessa Walters was really kind of quirky modern dance. So it was something that was mainstream electro pop music, but then also very performance art at the same time. And I still have like a nostalgic memories of, we toured through Europe. We went to like most of the countries in Europe. We also did some of South America. We did Sao Paulo and Bogota, Mexico City. We did a show in Moscow. And then recently, there was in Brooklyn, in the Prospect Park bandshell, Fisher Spooner was coming, doing a show. But by that time, the show that I was in was already done, and there was it was a new album. It was a different aesthetic, and there was new dancers that we weren't a part of anymore. But there was this idea, like, since it's in Brooklyn and all of the old dancers are here, let's do a reunion. So we like relearned the choreography to Emerge, which is their big hit. So I'm like, pretty much a retired dancer, like getting back into dancer shape. So we did two of the pieces that we used to do on tour, and it was like one of the most fun experiences of my life, with a big audience. And I still I feel like if there was a way to still like keep that going in my life, I would. I don't know how to do it as I age and approach aging and death. Like how to keep that spirit alive. Yeah,
but that's amazing. That was just recently too, right?
Yeah, it was. was it over this? It must have been over the summer.
Last year.
That's when they do those summer concerts. Yeah. So yeah, we got the old group back together. We relearned the choreography. It was really fun. It was like, and we were kind of joking about it, like grandma's on stage, because we're all like, I'm 40, or 41 now. So it's like getting the grandma team back together. But yeah, it was really a good time. The other thing that I was thinking about talking about was, so my first job out of social work school was working at LifeNet, the mental health crisis hotline. So my internship, my second internship in my social work program was at LifeNet, which is the mental health crisis hotline for New York City. It doesn't exist anymore. It changed into something different. But when I completed that internship, they offered me a full-time job working for LifeNet, and it was really interesting to be on the receiving end of just like phone calls that are coming in from the city. And some calls were crisis calls where I actually had to call EMS. I tried to go light on interventions and only do it when it's necessary. But then there was also other types of calls that we had frequent callers. And a lot of them were actually psychotic or diagnosed with schizophrenia. And they would call, and I would recognize their voice right away. And I think that introduced me or made me aware of their sort of different connection to the symbolic order, or like loose connection to the symbolic order, the way that of using speech and language. And like the terms that they would use for it would be like tangential or disorganized, or but just like a different connection to words, to where like, using words in a different way than we usually do. And mainly what I would do with those calls is just listen to them and not challenge their delusions, or just listen and agree. And I think that's all that they needed. And they would call like on a nightly basis, and I was like, "Hey, Mike, how's it going?" So there was that type of call. And then the other thing that was interesting, in New York City, there's city information, which is 311, if you call 311. And if you have some complaint about, your apartment building or whatever, you could call 311 and make a complaint. So if someone called 311 and they seemed psychotic or delusional, they would forward the call to us. But it seemed like they didn't tell the person that they were forwarding the call. So it's like they still thought they were reporting to the city. And they're like, yeah, my neighbor, they're sneaking into my apartment during the night, and they're taking all of my stuff and they're replacing it with other stuff that looks the same, but it's not the same. It's inferior items, like identical inferior items in my apartment. And you just say, oh, that sounds unsettling. I'm sorry that's happening. Tell me more about it, and just go with that. But I found it really interesting. And because I haven't had the chance to work in a hospital setting where I have more close contact with schizophrenia or a more overt psychosis, that it's for me, it was an introduction to their way of relating to language, and also their delusions or hallucinations, if you want to call it that, at kind of almost from a place of observation, because I'm not their therapist and I'm not their psychiatrist, but just like someone who's listening. So it was a good opportunity for me to learn about that with limited without there being that much at stake. Like I wasn't responsible for this person's well-being, like limited liability in a sense, which I think was a really good experience for me to just like have that period of like observation.
And probably for them too, because you're not going to like do something about it. You're not going to prescribe something or make an intervention. You're listening. And probably usually when they go to a doctor or someone they know and are talking about that, they do try to do something about it.
Yeah, like medicate them or try to
tell them they're wrong.
Yeah, reality testing. Which is like the last thing they need. So yeah, I found that experience to be really valuable for me.
Yeah, that's something I would have never thought of, that there's patients that use the crisis line kind of regularly as a support, like on a nightly basis almost.
Yeah, which is also a good sign, especially for somebody who is like overtly psychotic. That like they are making some connection to the social link by calling us. Like they're not so like immersed in their own. Like referring to Freud's idea on narcissism, that psychosis, like everything is so connected inward, that there is something reaching outward towards speaking to other people. I think is a good sign on their part.
It's nice that the hotlines are being used in that way. And not just for, like, say, a crisis like a suicidal person or something like that. It's great that they're there for that too, but it's good that they're used in other ways as well. I knew somebody that worked at this thing that I think is a little bit newer. It's like a crisis text line that they have where you can just text, I guess because people are used to texting more nowadays. They would just text in and talk to people that way and like check in.
Yeah, that's kind of what happened to LifeNet doesn't exist anymore. It turned into NYC Well, which they expanded their services to include instant messaging and text, which I think is a good idea. I think on our end it didn't quite work, and that's when I left actually. And I think part of it we were understaffed. So if I was on a crisis or a text with someone, and if another text came in, I had to take both simultaneously, and like I'll try to manage two different conversations at once, which I'm not very good at multitasking, and I felt like I was doing a crappy job, like splitting my attention between two different people. And it just got to the point where it's like this. I'm not like I felt like I wasn't doing service to the people texting in, where I'm like, that was the point when I decided to leave.
Yeah, that's hard though, especially if they're both like critical situations. It's difficult to have to split your attention like that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Where else did you intern or do rotations?
My first year, so the Master's in Social Work is a 2-year program. So you have one field placement internship for your first year, and then you have the second year. The first year I was at Safe Horizon, which is an organization for people in domestic violence situations. And I liked it there. I felt like I didn't get enough or as much as I wanted experience being like a psychotherapist. It was more concrete services.
Like case management.
Yeah, like people applying to housing and also to like the Office of Victim Services to get compensation for certain things. But it was, I feel like I had like 2 people that I would call like patients who came for the time of my field placement there, and they came weekly, and I felt like that was what I felt like I was doing, like my sort of naive version of psychotherapy with them. In retrospect, I was fumbling through just really not knowing what I was doing. But
that's what your first year's for. That's how you're learning.
Yeah.
Training. Yeah, but that's the thing. My job at the hospital, the more we lost staff, the more cases each of us that remained would get, because every time somebody would leave, they wouldn't replace them. And so by the end, I was just doing case management, and I'm like, why am I a psychologist and I'm just doing like applying for grants and applying for SSI and things like that, which patients needed. I mean, I can't do therapy with them and help them feel better if their material needs aren't being met and they don't have stable housing and that sort of thing. But it's just really a shame that people in those critical situations are, for the most part, only getting case management and not really getting intensive psychotherapy that could really be useful at those times.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Julie Fotheringham, psychoanalyst, dancer, and performance artist in New York City. For more, please visit her website, juliefotheringham.net. Our publisher's website, Trapart.net. renderingunconscious.org, and my website, drvanessasinclair.net. Dared to traverse. Then announces that perversion as sexual. We are all acts, pleasure, that deviate from the purpose, that we are all perverse. Dominant and submissive, we gain pleasure, consciousness, gender, and sexuality that make or structure was completely dismantled. The attempts to break down human sexuality while ourselves, to ourselves, polymorphously perverse. Likely a course as any, described perversion in this way. Everyone that I've ever dreamed of being. These categories, but this is all part of human. Therefore, occupy both, and all have dared to traverse. Sexuality is fluid, and the object that we are simply sexual. Thoughts about Freud, and as they were both working, desire is, are the, attribute is perfect, experiences and each is just as valid, and third mind, in this case, a third being,